Welcome to Quantum Potential, a podcast dedicated to curiosity, discovery, and the bold new ideas shaping our future. I'm Sibel Raver, Provost of Vanderbilt University. How does our commitment to democracy shape what we know? How does our commitment to participate in democracy lead us to either raise the intensity or lower the heat when we disagree with our fellow citizens? Today, I'm especially pleased to welcome Dr. Robert B. Talisse, the W. Alton Jones Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Political Science, here at Vanderbilt as one of our leading professors in this area. He dives right in, leveraging both theory and data to answer these questions. How can democratic societies endure and even flourish amid deep and persistent disagreement? This is the subject of his newest book, Sustaining Democracy, What We Owe to the Other Side, and I'm super excited to learn so much as we discuss it. Bob, welcome to Quantum Potential.
Well, thank you for having me. It's really nice to be here.
Awesome. Let me begin here. We tend to assume that democracy falters when citizens don't care enough, when citizens' participation in things like voting and elections declines, or when citizens' apathy appears to be on the rise. But you identify a really different and frankly more unsettling challenge, I think. Something that I think we feel in this current climate and that we care about deeply but don't really know how to talk about, which is that we are at risk of caring so deeply about an issue that we lose sight of the principle that our political adversaries are our equals in terms of their rights as citizens to also shape programs and policies. Such an incredibly important intellectual arrow thrown into the mix. This is such a great insight. We begin to see our adversaries not only as wrong, but as unjust, unprincipled, and even perhaps unacceptable or beyond the pale when we engage in this adversarial, highly contested, heated discussion. And you place before us this fascinating and important idea that democracy asks a lot of us. You have that phrase in the book several times, and I love it, that it foists upon citizens a moral burden.
Right.
Can you just go ahead and tell us more? That's just such a great place for us to start.
Sure. So, it's not hard in thinking about democracy and reading about democracy to get the impression that advocates of democracy, and in fact, to be an advocate of democracy is to think that democracy can have it all, right? That if we just got the institutions right, if we got the practices right, if we got the conversations right, democracy will be smooth sailing.
Yeah.
And the central sort of claim of the Sustaining Democracy book is that that's just not true. So one way to see that that's not true is say, well, democracy is more than merely a system of collective decision-making by means of elections. Democracy is the moral ideal of aspiring for a society of self-governing equals. And that indicates that citizens have two kinds of civic responsibility. On the one hand, they have to deploy their civic and political power on behalf of justice as they can best see it. So each of us as a citizen, we each have the job of trying to act civically in ways that advance our best understanding of what justice requires. But in the midst of doing that, all that participation and arguing and debate, all the good stuff you were talking about earlier, we also have to maintain within ourselves the capacity to see our fellow citizens as our co-equal partners in that endeavor, even when, especially when, we disagree about justice. So democracy is this sort of strained, I want to say, moral posture where I've got to work for justice. I also have to see my fellow citizens as my equals. That is, I have to see them not merely as people who get an equal say. I have to see them as people who are entitled to have an equal say. Yeah. And those two things don't sit well together when the stakes are high and when the political decision looks to us like really important. If we disagree about something that I think is really important, Sibel, I have to see you not merely as on the other side, but on the wrong side.
Yeah.
And so the challenge is, how do I develop within myself and maintain within myself the capacity, and I would say the virtues appropriate for that kind of sort of strained posture towards you. I see you as on the wrong side of the question, but nonetheless, I see you as my fellow citizen, my co-equal partner in trying to advance justice. And even when you put it that way, it does look kind of tortured, right?
Yeah, and I also really love that idea that that means that I have to be prepared for your side, your viewpoint to occasionally win, and that might actually be coercive
That's right.
in terms of placing me and my side in a one down position, or in a position where I don't get my vision of justice to prevail, right? And in so doing, I have a responsibility to put up with and live with the times that your side wins, but also you have an obligation to not place me in such a negatively coercive environment that I
That's right.
will either attempt to retaliate or
That's right.
rebel, right?
That's exactly right. So the thought is that, as we are equals, that's the democratic aspiration, self-government among equals. I have a responsibility to try to do what I can when engaging politically and trying to get the government to act in certain ways to ensure that government exercises of power, exercises of political power more broadly, are never merely brute.
Yeah.
Right? That the person who loses in the vote, the person whose candidate doesn't get elected, has to be able to see on the day after the election, right, that the government, if I don't like what the government's doing, I still have an equal say. I'm still an equal. I can still be an effective voice, critical voice. I still have modes of democratic resistance open to me, and that the government's power over me when I lose isn't simply just final.
Yeah.
And part of the way that we ensure that is by keeping open the channels of contestation, critique, debate. But again, going back to this tension, it's like when my side wins, I feel like justice has prevailed.
Yeah. No,
End of story.
absolutely. Right. And I can't wait to get to the discussion about team membership and polarization, because I think that's super important.
Sure.
But first, I just want to stay with this idea of the Democrats' dilemma, and you use Democrats with a little d.
That's right.
That this strained relationship enforces upon us essentially a dilemma that we are constantly trying to navigate. Do you want to say a little bit more about the dilemma that you outlined so beautifully?
Yeah. So the dilemma is the two responsibilities I mentioned a moment ago: pursue justice, treat your fellow citizens show your fellow citizens that you recognize their equality. Sort of pull us in opposing directions when politics is really important to us and when the issues are salient. And, we often think about sort of ways that democracy fails, where the citizens look like they're the site of the breakdown. We have to think of those like cases where the citizens aren't informed or aren't doing what they should be doing. Why I call it the Democrats' dilemma is because this conflict between the responsibility to try to advance justice and the responsibility to show due regard for the equality of your fellow citizens. It's like, no, we're thrust into this conflict in the course of actually trying to meet our civic responsibilities. This isn't a case of lying down on the job and so democracy fails, right? The Democrats' dilemma is that, wait a minute, if I see you as somebody, if you get your way, the world becomes less just, and I have a responsibility, civic responsibility, to try to advance justice. Looks like now I've got a bit of a moral argument, a bit of a moral reason to try to shut you down.
Absolutely.
And that looks like it's a violation of the civic ethos of a democracy. And yet it looks like it's internal, right? That's why I want to say it's the Democrats' dilemma. It's like our responsibilities pull us in these opposing directions. And so it's not only that democracy can't have it all, it's not only that democracy asks a lot of us, it sometimes asks of us things that no one person can give.
So fascinating. Or that we can't give in equal measure all the time.
That's exactly right. Can't give fully, right?
Yeah.
Something's got to use a different, something's got to give.
Yeah. No, fascinating. And I think that notion of good faith and virtue, right? That you frame out when something that we're fighting about or fighting for broaches into okay, now the dilemma actually tilts. Now the dilemma tilts because it is so manifestly inhumane or unjust that we can not actually tolerate the principled disagreement.
Right.
But as I understand it, you're willing to give a large amount of room for error or debate and disagreement about that, given that that's the first card we throw down, right?
That's right.
That is so easy for me to go to if I disagree with you, is to say that your view is just
beyond the pale. Yes, that's exactly right. But notice the upshot of that kind of what looks to me like a dysfunctional civic stance that I think is becoming more and more prevalent. Like anybody who's not on my side of the issues is not only mistaken about politics, is an anti-democrat,
Yes.
right? Listen, the upshot of that is the idea that strikes me as the sort of the most anti-democratic thought in all of human history. Democracy is possible only when everyone's just like me.
Yeah.
Like that is a more anti-democratic thought than anybody will find in any anti-democratic passage in Plato.
Yeah. Right. No, hive mind is a terrifying idea, right?
That's right. That's exactly right.
So let's talk about democracy more broadly.
Sure.
How do you define democracy? And I love this idea of democracy as a practical ideal, right? You know, I think as a third grader, we all learned the various institutions that are the component parts of democracy, or we learned some key principles from the Constitution, from the Declaration of Independence. But this idea that it's a lived ideal, a practical ideal. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So just to go back, the sort of schoolyard view of democracy is it's a decision-making procedure. Each person gets a vote, the majority wins. And in some cases, you know, democracy as a form of government and as a system of political association is a scaled-up version of that in many ways. However, democracy is also a kind of constitution. It's a rule of law, a commitment to the rule of law. It's a institutional order that separates powers and checks and where they check and balance one another. So democracy has got all of these sort of institutional and decision-making sort of components. It's very hard to make sense, though, of why we so centrally associate democracy with those institutional and sort of with the decision-making context. Like, I don't know, why is democracy about elections? Why don't we pick
the fundamental value that's undergirding that?
Good. Why don't we pick leaders by lottery? Looks like it's much more egalitarian, right? So, like, no, elections are really important. Why? Well, we have to see those practices and those institutions as serving an ideal.
Yeah, I remember ranked choice voting in New York City, right? It seemed super, super strange to depart from the idea of plurality of vote, right? Just in first round counts, right? So this idea of how come we do it the way we do it, right?
That's right. And so in order to think that, why is it this institution or this set of practices or this kind of constitutional order? We have to think like, well, institutions are tools, right? What are they tools for? Well, it's for an ideal. What's the ideal? Again, a self-governing society of political equals. Now, no society lives up to the ideal. That's what an ideal is. It's an aspiration. And when I say it's a practical aspiration, I mean it's the kind of achievement that we as a society, we as individual citizens in our civic behavior, we as members of political coalitions have to always keep in mind that, you know, democracy is not simply a matter of trying to transform the political world in the way that you want it to look. Democracy is a matter of always asking the question, right? What can I impose on my fellow citizens who are my equals in the name of making the society better when we disagree, right?
Fascinating. And so, Bob, help us understand what philosophers do. You are an actively, a working philosophy PhD, right? And so this idea of practical ideals more broadly, can you help us place that in the context of the study of philosophy and how you work?
Sure. So, I'm always happy to cheerlead for philosophy.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. We live in our day-to-day lives according to certain commitments. We have certain values, priorities, and it's often the case that those values, those projects, those priorities, those aims appear to us as sort of just brute facts given to us by the world in the way that we might say the atomic structure.
Right. I was raised in it. It makes sense. Those are my priors.
Just the way the world is.
Yeah.
And it turns out that, there's even in hard sciences, dig deep enough, there are really deep questions, right? The things that looked fixed and brute are actually sort of like there are debates, there are questions, there are unanswered questions. And so philosophy is the discipline that tries to remind us in the midst of all of the normalcy around us, that just a little bit underneath the veneer of normalcy, there is a wide open sea of deep, important questions that it's very easy to fool ourselves into thinking we've got the answers to.
I love that image. I swim a lot in open water, and the idea of there's a lot lurking underneath, right?
That's
That
right.
there's a lot of life happening beneath the surface of, in that sea is such a great metaphor
Oh,
of
thank you.
what
Yeah.
a philosophy faculty member is doing with this group of students, right?
Well,
or
it's-
in a
it-
book, or as an intellectual, as a public intellectual in the
That's
world.
right. That's right. It's a funny discipline in a lot of ways, precisely because part of what's lurking in that sea is just the question of, like, what does it mean to learn something?
Yeah.
What's knowledge? Philosophy is the discipline that still has debates over what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very helpful to frame the way in which the epistemological, the creation of new knowledge, is tied to values in the way that you unpack a construct like democracy,
Oh,
right?
good, yeah.
That this idea that it's not simply a set of institutions or a set of, practices, but actually a set of values. And what I love about the work that you're doing is that you take us through the logical consequence or the logical implication of a given set of precepts. So if I believe that you are my equal and you do something that I really disagree with, what are my options rather than, and why do I feel so fiercely
Right.
about what I'm arguing for, what I want, and why winning might be really dislocating to me?
That's right.
When will you feel like you have enough? From panic buying to FOMO to the relentless drive for more, why does the fear of running out sharpen our focus while also dictating our most irrational behaviors? On the next Quantum Potential, get ready for a fascinating conversation with scarcity expert and a professor of marketing, Kelly Goldsmith. Now, let's get back to my conversation with Robert.
Holding off on political polarization, there's this other phenomenon called polarization that I call in the book belief polarization, which is not strictly about politics. It is a social cognitive, social psychological phenomenon that is, shockingly, strikingly widespread. So belief polarization is the tendency for members of like-minded groups to transform into more extreme versions of themselves as they interact together.
Yeah.
And more extreme here means in belief polarization, individual members of a like-minded group come to hold a more extreme version of the group's shared beliefs. They come to hold those more extreme versions of the beliefs with a higher degree of commitment. And they come to adopt a more elevated and exaggerated conception of how confident they are entitled to be in their judgments about these things. Belief polarization is not strictly political. If you get a bunch of people together, all of whom agree that Denver, Colorado is notable for being high above sea level.
I love that you gave those examples, like things that you would think were pretty common sense or easily empirically verifiable.
Right, a banal
could
fact of the
become-
world.
right.
How high above sea level
Right.
is Denver, Colorado? The longer the people talk about the elevation of Denver, Colorado, the higher they start saying it is.
The bigger fish
This is exactly
was
right.
caught.
That's
right,
This is
by
exactly
my-
right.
My
So-
team of fishermen. Yeah.
Exactly. So, there are all kinds of other experiments about the comfortableness of chairs and things. You get a bunch of people together and they say, oh, the chair on the right is the more comfortable one. It's the most comfortable one in the room. The more they talk about how comfortable the chair is, the more comfortable they say it is. So it's these are banal matters of fact about the world. When it comes to sort of more complicated stuff like value judgments, political judgments, we have this vulnerability such that our political coalitions set us up to become more extreme versions of ourselves.
Yes.
Now, you might say, well, what's wrong with being a more extreme version of yourself? Well, it looks like as you become more extreme, more confident, more committed, it becomes harder and harder for you to make good sense of how there could be anybody in his or her right mind that doesn't agree with you.
Yes.
And so the idea that my political adversary, my political opponent, my political critic is also my equal becomes harder and harder to sustain as we transform into these more extreme
Love it.
positions.
So it really tips that dilemma toward being able to derogate
That's
and,
exactly
and
right.
discount the viewpoint of the other.
Shut down the other guy because and encourages the thought that you were mentioning before. Anybody who disagrees with me is beyond the pale.
Yeah.
They're incompetent.
Yeah.
Right?
And then that you then point out that there might be a leader or a colleague who stokes that view of the unacceptability or the terribleness of the other side because it binds me more tightly to my group. It binds me more tightly to action.
That's exactly
It binds
right.
me more tightly to giving money to my organization.
That's
or
right.
So that notion of fomenting not only difference but dislike,
That's right.
I thought was, a really remarkable sort of interjection into how we think about philosophy, but also psychology and how they both get sort of utilized
That's right.
in these very powerful moments.
That's right. So let me say one other thing, though, just picking up on that, because it's common for people when they talk about polarization as a bad feature of our politics, the emphasis is almost always placed on toxic relations among political adversaries.
Yeah.
And that is a problem. But we see that the real problematic aspect of polarization is this sort of tendency towards the more extreme within our coalitions. It's like the problem of polarization actually has more to do with allies than with adversaries.
Yes.
Because as our groups become more extreme in belief polarization, they also become more internally homogeneous. So our coalitions become like-minded group members as they believe polarized, not only become more extreme, they also become more alike along a lot of different kinds of metrics. They start wearing similar kinds of clothes. This is still true in the United States, one sort of clear indicator of whether, if you're listening to a speaker talk about certain countries in the Middle East, one clear indicator of what their political alliances are is how they pronounce the name of the country, IRAN, Iran or Iran.
Got it.
And right, you say got it, how the partisans split up, right? If somebody's talking about Iraq or Iran, chances are that's a liberal.
That's so fascinating. And the way in which we shape each other's and our own behaviors and speech patterns in our own groups. But also, I loved the point that you hit upon, which is that the group starts to, I don't know if you feel this way, but I imagine sort of the group starts to cannibalize, right?
That's exactly right.
And I remember this from vegetarian potlucks in my graduate school days, right? Where we were all committed to that particular value at that particular time. But then there was the issue of dairy, and then there was the issue of honey, and was honey a product of an animal which was a bee? And so suddenly who we could exclude based on affinity and or compliance with whatever the group norm was became tighter and tighter.
That's exactly right. So as our coalitions become more homogeneous across a broader range of sites, we become more conformist. We become more invested in conformity among our allies. And as we become more invested in conformity among our allies, we start developing within the group litmus tests for authenticity. And we develop a whole vernacular for talking about fakes and posers. Rhino and Dino, for example, right? Republican or Democrat in name only, right? Yes. And so what happens is exactly as you were saying, that eventually polarization causes like-minded coalitions to splinter and to factionalize. So, people sometimes, say to me when I go around and talk about this stuff, like, well, you're so invested in me caring about the other side. I don't care about they're wrong. Why should I care about them? So you have to care about the other side if you care about holding your own coalition together. If you break off relations with your political opposition, the forces of division and factionalization and tribalism don't disappear. They turn inward on your, and they turn your friends into your political enemies.
So this great idea that figuring out how to keep your mind open to the other side, quote unquote, keeps you not only really more open to more information, more disconfirming evidence, more commitment to, helping them not to rule you in ways that you find coercive, but also keeps your own community more vibrant, more healthy, more accepting, more open to new ideas.
And let's say that's exactly right. Let's add one more thing. More politically potent. right? A
Fascinating.
splintering, if you want to have an effective democratic voice, not only do you have to join a choir, you have to build it. You have to, right? And if it's splintered and factionalized, people sort of hive off into smaller and smaller groups. Small groups are politically inefficacious.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love the example that you gave. So in the book, you mentioned being in part of a debate about whether to televise capital punishment, right? And the assumption that your opponent made was that you were for capital punishment and therefore should be ruled as quote unquote beyond the pale.
Right.
When in fact, you had lots of information to share about how you actually shared the value of being against capital punishment, but you were for televising so as to make clear that, the inhumane practice.
Right.
That idea that the person that you were debating was missing out on important information, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I just find that so fascinating as a scientist, but I think about that too as a person just as part of, a large citizenry.
That's right. And, it also sort of invokes a premise that I just think it's very implausible, that your view about whether execution should be televised is logically connected to your view about the permissibility or impermissibility of capital punishment, or any other kind of example, right? Sort of your view about the moral status of animals is logically connected to your view about deforestation or whatever.
Yeah.
I also teach logic here at this university every once in a while. It's like, these are not logically connected, so that you can't infer, right, with certitude, right, what somebody is going to hold about position, with respect to issue A by looking at what they hold with respect to position B. It's a complicated world, and there are all kinds of different ways to put commitments together. And so the idea that in this particular instance, we were having a debate about whether execution should be televised, and this very prominent guy showed up and just proceeded as if, because I thought that they should be, I must also think that capital punishment is permissible. And so when we started the debate, and so I agree, capital punishment is unjust. When the government's doing unjust things, it doesn't get to hide it from the citizens.
Yeah.
That's the argument. And it seemed to me like a simple thing to say. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's not right. I happen to think it is right. But it just dismantled the whole thing. Because
so interesting.
Stack of paper is all about why capital punishment was unjust. And once I'm like, I agree with you about that.
Right. Suddenly
it was like, okay, this is
totally different terms. The argument was being placed on totally different terms.
Now we're not really able to have this debate because you're not prepared.
I love that you just talked about teaching students about logic because of that idea that, that you just highlighted. If you hold a set of beliefs around one issue and they seem adjacent to B set of beliefs that are not actually logically connected, but nonetheless close, I might gain power in some way by asserting your wrongness, right? That I'm more right because I see those two as aligned or connected, and therefore I'm going to assert that if you believe differently on B, even though we agree on A, I'm way right? And you're completely wrong.
Yeah, and a lot of character assassination in politics works exactly that way.
Yeah. So how does it work for you to be able to open a class up to be able to support students in expanding and their understanding of that nuance?
That is a constant subject of my own reflection on teaching at this university. At Vanderbilt, we have a wonderful student population of extremely gifted, very high-achieving students. And one of the benefits of all of that is they show up on campus ready to learn. They've got the skills. They know how to write. They know how to read carefully. They can express themselves very, very well. All that's to the good. But just to go back to an earlier comment I made about the nature of philosophy, these highly gifted, wonderful students show up with a view about the world as so much is fixed, right? There are pathways. Some of them lead to Yale Law School. Some of them lead to Harvard Medical School. And I'm on the path, and I've got my marching orders, and I'm going to excel. Wonderful, right? Not disparaging. That's wonderful. But there is a kind of... in some cases, it even at the beginning of every semester sort of gives me a little pause. I'm like, I'm going to go in front of some classes, 120 students. We're going to talk about things that's going to disrupt that a little bit. And, there are risks. There are risks that, somebody might, I don't know how often this is the case.
The
Somebody
idea that
might,
you're sort of like going to just totally rattle their world.
and they might decide that they want to become poets and not go to Harvard Medical School, by the way, which seems to me like a wonderful thing,
I
but
would
could
say,
create all kinds of problems with their
as your
parents.
provost, I'm good with that.
I'm-
Right? No, but I think that idea that opportunities for exploration can mean occasionally being shaken,
That's exactly right.
in how we see the world. Not physically, obviously, but in serious hold up. I thought the world was one way.
That's right.
And I came from high school with a set of beliefs, priors, attitudes, values. If anything, we hope that students come here because they're excited
Right.
to be around other types of people with other types of viewpoints, with other types of life experience, right?
That's right.
So
That's one of the real rewards of teaching
Yeah.
at this level at a university. But I think it's at least maybe as I'm getting older, it's to be the agent that excites a student in that way, that from the point of view of a guy with a sport coat on,
Right.
like, this is a wonderful progress. It's like it might not be experienced by them as progress.
Yeah.
And it can be very unsettling to say, well, I thought that like it was just a brute fact about the world, that here's what success is. And then say, well, there are all kinds of different ways of thinking about what makes a life successful, what's worth pursuing in life, what's worth making of your life. And then to just sort of like lay out like different complications and trying to think carefully through those big questions of life might not lead them like in the same place they were before. That's progress for us academics.
I love that. I love that, to just circle back to the idea that is about practical ideals, right?
That's right.
That you've opened up this conversation to focus on the practical ideal of democracy, but you are also talking about the practical ideal of success, or what does winning look like, or right?
Having a good life.
Or having a good
happiness.
life. Exactly.
Right? All that
Amazing.
stuff, right?
So to turn back to the unsettling proposition that you placed before us at the beginning, which is that democracy involves this incredibly intense sort of sense of tension or burden or challenge. What is the solution, Bob? You lay out great sort of next steps, and they don't involve going to more
Right.
break bread with your opponent. And
That's right.
there's not a Pollyanna-ish vibe to the final chapters of your book, I'll just say.
I don't do optimism. I'm not a pessimist either, so I'm somewhere in between. So, this the book we're talking about now, Sustaining Democracy, is the second in a trilogy of books. And the first book was called Overdoing Democracy. And it proposed a kind of prescription that is sort of in the background of what's going on in the book we're talking about now. And part of what I proposed there is that part of what's been lost culturally in particularly our democracy is social spaces and cooperative activities that are not already organized around our partisan allegiances. And so in the United States today, whether your kid plays soccer or football is tightly tied to how you vote.
Fascinating.
Right? Whether you buy your coffee at Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts, it's coded, right? It's very hard to run into a liberal voter in a Dunkin' Donuts in the United States, except in Massachusetts for reasons we can go into. Starbucks skews heavily liberal. One of the clearest predictors of whether you voted for Barack Obama is how close you live to a Whole Foods market.
Wow. So that you point that out, that the increasingly densely populated communities that we all live in are increasingly segregated by political affiliation.
That's right. And so what that means is that chance, unplanned encounters with your fellow citizens, where I can see you at your best and not see you as a political ally, but just see you as like, oh, just
a human,
just a human, a fellow citizen, a human, somebody who's, caring, somebody who's nurturing, somebody who's intelligent, right? All of those things. Somehow, because our social spaces have become segregated according to partisan affiliation, sorted into political nodes, every time I see good behavior on the part of somebody, I think, that guy's an ally with me politically. Every time I see somebody driving badly, I say, I know who he votes for, right? And so the idea that the way out of these political dysfunctions is more or even better politics seems to me to be an error. I think that what needs to be part of what needs to be done is sort of reclaiming certain kinds of cooperative endeavors for certain kinds of sort of social encounters, rather, for cooperative endeavors that are just not about politics.
Yeah.
And that we strain to think about what that could look like looks to me like a symptom of the problem.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Totally.
Yeah.
I mean, the notion that I belong to a book group. I know generally how everyone in the book group votes, but we try really hard to focus on the book and not on the politics, right? That's work.
It's work.
It's exciting work.
That's right.
And because I'm a relative newcomer to Nashville, I could select into a book group rather than be having that shaped by virtue of where I was living, right?
That's exactly right.
Are there other examples of ways in which we can proactively place ourselves in, these zones that allow us to reconnect to the equality of our fellow citizens?
Good. Let me tell you a Nashville story as a
Great.
person who, moved here 25 years ago from New York. So when I came to Nashville right out of graduate school to come take a job at Vanderbilt, I knew nothing about what we'll now say is real country music or bluegrass, knew nothing about this. And soon started hearing people say, oh, you got to go to this place called the Station Inn. Have you ever been to the Station Inn?
I have.
Okay, cool. So I started going to the Station Inn, wonderful bluegrass venue in Nashville, kind of like a dive bar setting, but it's very humble. But really high quality music that again, I'm an amateur musician not of that genre, and sort of found the music sort of interesting. But as I would regularly show up on their sort of open mic night just to listen, I started having a conversation with a particular person who was also there, who, the academic in me had all kinds of reasons to think this person probably doesn't vote for the same people I vote for. But our interaction was all about what was on the stage. And this was a gentleman who had an amazing command of the history of this musical genre. And was able to point things out like the guy on the mandolin's grandfather wrote this song.
How beautiful.
All kinds of and would say, he'll just lean over and say, oh, look at what the upright bass player is doing, And I sort of started saying I cannot see this person as a failed human being. This person has a deep historical sensitivity, aesthetic sensibility, an amazing command of some very technical aspects of live performance. I think if he votes, I think he's probably wrong on a lot of the political issues. I think that we are opponents politically.
Yeah.
But now that adversariality is now contextualized within a humanizing background where I can't see him as a total enemy.
No, it's great.
Right.
It's so great. And I would love you to just encapsulate sort of what are the habits and the virtues that you're, really focused on there, or that you would prescribe for a student or all of us here, right, to avoid that increasing polarization.
Yeah, I just think that open-mindedness, willingness to listen, listen first. But I also think that in addition to the open-mindedness, the openness to being challenged, the willingness to hear the other side, I think there are also a set of, all of which I endorse, I think there are also a set of sort of self-regarding virtues that are often not central to this conversation. That is the willingness to regard oneself as improvable, for example, right? That's not just about understanding. Understanding the other people around you is really important, but part of its importance is, I think, is dependent upon the attitude that I can be improved by them, even if I think they're wrong.
Yeah, I love that you highlight that toward the end of the book, the sort of humility
That's exactly
of
right.
leaving the door open to your own certitude, right?
That's right.
That kind of opportunity for checking that righteousness when you start to feel it build.
That's right.
I thought was really a great point.
For each of us, democracy is hard and important work. And when we're doing hard and important work in almost every other field, right? Just think about airline pilots, right? Self-monitoring your own habits, your own dispositions, thinking reflectively about the tendencies that you have that can lead you to do less well, or even just think about the pilots. Doesn't matter that you don't feel tired. After a certain number of hours, you've got to stop. right? So having that kind of like self-regarding way of thinking about what you're bringing to the enterprise of democracy is, I think, really, really central to making democracy healthy, to sustaining it, to mitigating some of its failures. But that's not work between you and me. It's ultimately work within each of us.
Absolutely.
And I think that often, I think inadvertently, gets short shrift, even among democracy advocates who tend really to focus on the interpersonal,
Yes.
which is important, but it's also within us.
So great. Bob, if I were going to ask you for one note of hope or for something that you feel hopeful about, what would that be?
I think that what there is to hope for, what's hopeful, is that there are the beginnings, it seems to me, of places within our broader community where I think the idea that when everything we do together is politics, we do politics badly, is becoming more evident to people. The idea that the NFL, the singer that you like, that this doesn't have to be consumed by political affiliation, that there could be something outside of politics that's worth recognizing and nurturing so that when it's time to do politics, we can be better at it. I think that there are signs that that idea is becoming more evident to people.
Great. This idea of common ground.
That's right. And common ground not already claimed for politics.
Yes. Common ground on enjoyment or appreciation or
That's right.
values.
Something else. Yeah,
something outside of politics that helps us to actually see each other more connectedly,
Right.
more democratically, more equally.
That's right.
When we get around to having to do or loving to do politics.
That's exactly right. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Bob.
you.
I think of this place in terms of this institution as just such an exciting place to have this conversation, that Vanderbilt is really committed to those principles and the ways in which you really suggest for us that we lean into that challenge rigorously, courageously, and with a spirit of genuine inquiry. I really thank you for not only showing us what democracy asks of us, but what we can offer to ourselves and to one another. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
The Quantum Potential podcast comes from Vanderbilt University. I'm your host, Sibel Raver, Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs with Vanderbilt University. Thank you to our guest, Robert Talisse, W. Alton Jones Chair in Philosophy and Professor of Political Science in the College of Arts and Science. This episode was edited and mixed by the team at Sound On, Sound Off. You can learn more about their work at soundonsoundoff.com. For more information about quantum potential, go to vanderbilt.edu/quantum potential. Thank you for joining us today for the Quantum Potential podcast. Stay tuned for more conversations with the thinkers and innovators reshaping our world. I'm Sibel Raver, and this has been Quantum Potential.